The morning everything changed started like every other morning I'd had for almost 15 years. I walked out onto my back porch barefoot with a mug of black coffee warming my hands, the kind of quiet that only exists in the country, hanging over the fields while the sun fought its way through a blanket of mist. My property sat outside the little town of Ash Hollow, where my grandfather bought 53 acres after coming home from Vietnam. It wasn't fancy land, just pasture, hardwood trees, a creek that never completely dried up, and enough peace to make you forget the rest of the world existed. Every single morning, before checking fences or feeding my horses, I glanced toward one spot without even thinking about it. A little wooden bridge crossed the creek about 200 yards behind the house. My dad and I built it together when I was 19. He wasn't much for speeches, but he believed a man should leave behind things that lasted longer than himself. We spent 3 weekends cutting cedar beams, arguing about measurements, laughing when one side sank into the mud because we forgot to brace it properly. Every dent in those handrails had a memory attached to it. After Dad passed away from cancer 6 years earlier, that bridge somehow became the place where I still talk to him. Sounds silly saying it out loud, but grief makes ordinary things sacred. That morning I looked toward the creek out of habit, and for a second my brain simply refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. The bridge wasn't there. I actually blinked a couple of times because I thought the fog was playing tricks on me. Then I set my coffee down so fast it splashed across the porch railing and started walking, then jogging, then running across the pasture. By the time I reached the creek, my stomach had already figured out what my mind didn't want to accept. Cedar beams floated in the water like broken bones. Fresh sawdust drifted downstream. Half the support posts had been sliced clean through by chainsaws. Whoever did it hadn't dismantled the bridge. They'd butchered it. I stood there frozen until I noticed muddy boot prints leading back toward the gravel road. Then I heard someone clear her throat behind me. "Well," the woman said with a smile that somehow managed to sound smug even before she finished the sentence. That eyesore finally came down. I turned around and there she was, Vivian Mercer, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Navy blue blazer, designer sunglasses, clipboard tucked under one arm like she was inspecting a military base instead of standing on somebody else's property. Behind her, 3 construction workers were climbing into pickup trucks so quickly you'd think the ground had caught fire. One of them looked at me, looked at the destroyed bridge, then looked away so fast it told me everything I needed to know. "You did this?" I asked quietly. Vivian smiled wider. "I authorized removal of an unsafe structure visible from our subdivision. Property values matter, Mr. Walker." I actually laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. "You know this isn't your subdivision, right?" She folded her arms. "People driving through our neighborhood can see this bridge from the north entrance. We received complaints." "From who?" "Residents." "Your residents." "Exactly." I looked around waiting for someone to tell me I was on some hidden camera show because nothing about this conversation sounded real. My farm wasn't inside Willow Creek Estates. Never had been. I'd never signed HOA paperwork, never paid dues, never attended one of their meetings. My property line sat almost 300 feet beyond the subdivision boundary. There wasn't even an easement connecting us. The only reason anyone from their neighborhood could see my bridge was because they built oversized houses on a hill overlooking farmland that had existed decades before their development. "Vivian," I said, trying harder than she deserved to stay calm, "you crossed a locked gate, brought contractors onto private land, and destroyed property that doesn't belong to you." She shrugged. "We improved the view." One of the contractors rolled down his window. "Ma'am, we really should go." She ignored him. "You'll thank us eventually." That bridge was outdated. I looked at the creek again and suddenly I wasn't angry about lumber anymore. I was angry because someone who had never met my father had decided his work meant nothing. Vivian couldn't have known what that bridge represented, but the scary part was, she didn't care enough to ask. My neighbor, Earl Benson, came bouncing down the pasture on his ATV after hearing the chainsaws earlier that morning. He stopped beside me, took one look at the creek, then slowly removed his hat. "Good Lord," he muttered. "Tom dealt that with you, Daddy." I nodded. Earl looked straight at Vivian. "You people have lost your minds." Vivian sighed dramatically. "Sir, this is an HOA compliance issue." Earl actually chuckled. "Lady, the nearest thing you own is that attitude." She turned on her heel and started walking toward her SUV. Before climbing inside, she looked back over her shoulder. "If you rebuild it, We'll simply have it removed again." Then she drove away. Just like that. As if she'd just finished discussing lawn decorations instead of destroying part of my family's history. I stood there for a long time listening to the creek move around broken cedar boards, remembering my father telling me that character wasn't measured by what people built, but by what they refused to tear down. At that moment, I realized something Vivian Mercer hadn't. She thought she'd won because she'd cut down a bridge. She had no idea she'd just built the strongest case against herself anyone could imagine. And before the week was over, that single decision would begin unraveling not only her position inside the HOA, but the entire illusion of authority she'd spent years bullying people into believing. Most people think revenge starts with yelling, lawsuits, or somebody making a dramatic speech. Mine started with a tape measure, a notebook, and complete silence. After Vivian drove away, Earl stood beside me for another minute before saying something that stuck with me for the rest of this mess. "Son, don't ever interrupt somebody while they're digging their own hole." Then he climbed back onto his ATV and headed home. I walked through what was left of the bridge one board at a time. Fresh chainsaw cuts, tire tracks leading across my lower pasture, broken cedar scattered nearly 30 feet downstream. They hadn't simply removed a structure. They had trespassed with heavy equipment, destroyed private property, disturbed a protected creek bank, and left debris inside the waterway. Every step revealed another mistake. Instead of calling my lawyer first, I called the county sheriff's office. Deputy Ryan Holt arrived about 40 minutes later, and unlike Vivian, he didn't say much before looking around. He photographed the tracks, measured the damage, examined the broken posts, then finally asked, "You know who did this?" I pointed toward Willow Creek Estates. Their HOA president admitted it herself. He slowly lowered his camera. "She admitted it?" said she improved the view. He stared at me for 2 seconds before quietly saying, "Well, that was generous of her." By lunchtime, the deputies had already located one of the contractors. Apparently, the crew hadn't gotten very far before deciding they wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever Vivian had dragged them into. The foreman, a middle-aged guy named Curtis Holloway, looked exhausted before he even started talking. "She told us," he explained, rubbing both hands across his face, "that her HOA owned an easement across this section. She showed us maps, said the county had approved removal." Deputy Holt asked one simple question. "Did you verify any of that?" Curtis looked down. "No." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "She told us if we didn't finish before the owner noticed, she'd find another contractor." Suddenly, this wasn't just destruction of property. It was planned, intentional, organized. Meanwhile, Vivian apparently believed she had nothing to worry about because that afternoon she emailed every resident inside Willow Creek Estates celebrating the removal of what she called an unauthorized rural structure that negatively affected neighborhood aesthetics. She even attached photographs. She was so proud of herself she documented the entire thing. Earl's granddaughter happened to work at the local insurance office, where half the town somehow heard everything within hours. By dinner, my phone had rung 12 times. Some calls came from old friends asking if the rumors were true. Others came from people who actually lived inside Willow Creek Estates. One woman named Melissa apologized before she even introduced herself. "Mr. Walker, I don't know you, but not everybody in there agrees with Vivian. She's been getting worse every year." We talked for nearly half an hour. By the end of that conversation, I learned something interesting. The bridge wasn't really about the bridge. It never had been. Vivian had spent the previous 3 years expanding HOA authority far beyond its legal boundaries. She fined homeowners over flower pots, threatened liens because children left bicycles outside, tried forcing residents to replace mailboxes that weren't even governed by the Covenanters. Every board meeting became less about maintaining a neighborhood and more about feeding one woman's obsession with control. The bridge simply happened to become her biggest target because she could see it from the subdivision entrance every morning while driving to work. She hated the idea that something existed outside her authority. That sentence echoed inside my head all night. Some people don't chase power because they need it. They chase it because they can't stand being reminded where it ends. The next morning, my attorney, Claire Donovan, drove out to the farm carrying 3 thick folders. Claire had represented ranchers, farmers, and landowners across the county for nearly 20 years. She walked down to the creek, looked at the destroyed bridge without saying a word, then smiled the kind of smile lawyers get when someone else has made a catastrophic mistake. "Please tell me she admitted ordering this." I handed her the email Melissa had forwarded and showed her the recording from one of my security cameras near the equipment shed. The camera didn't capture the bridge itself, but it clearly recorded Vivian arriving with the contractors and instructing them to continue after one worker hesitated at my locked gate. Claire watched the video twice before laughing. I've defended people with better judgment after 3 bottles of bourbon. Over the next 48 hours, pieces started falling into place faster than I expected. The county surveyor confirmed every inch of the bridge sat entirely on my property. Environmental officials inspected the creek because chainsaw debris had entered protected water. The sheriff documented unauthorized entry through a locked agricultural gate. Then Claire discovered something even more interesting buried inside county records. Willow Creek Estates had absolutely no easement, no maintenance agreement, no visual corridor rights, no conservation authority, nothing. Legally speaking, Vivian possessed exactly the same authority over my bridge as she did over the Golden Gate Bridge, which is to say, none. We filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for trespassing, destruction of property, emotional distress, restoration costs, environmental cleanup, and punitive damages. Then something unexpected happened. We didn't have to convince the public. Vivian handled that herself. Local news picked up the story after drone footage showed the destroyed bridge. The headline practically wrote itself. HOA president orders demolition outside neighborhood. Reporters camped outside Willow Creek Estates waiting for comments. Residents began asking uncomfortable questions. During the next HOA board meeting, which Melissa secretly recorded because state law allowed it, one board member asked Vivian the question everyone else had been thinking. Did our attorney approve this? Vivian answered. We didn't need legal approval. Another board member frowned. Did we vote on this? No. Did we even discuss it? No. Silence filled the room. Then someone quietly asked, do you understand what you've exposed this association to? Vivian's confidence finally cracked. Instead of admitting a mistake, she doubled down. If we apologize now, we admit liability. Claire nearly spit out her coffee when she heard that recording. She's trying to avoid admitting liability, while sitting in a recorded meeting admitting liability. Discovery began several weeks later, and that's where the entire story took another turn. Vivian's emails were subpoenaed, board communications, contractor invoices, phone records. One message stood out immediately. She had written to another board member nearly 2 weeks before the demolition. If Walker refuses to cooperate, we'll remove it first and let him complain afterward. He'll never spend the money to fight us. Claire slid the printed email across her desk toward me without saying anything. I read it twice. Oddly enough, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt disappointed. My father used to say the quickest way to learn someone's character was to watch what they believed they'd never be held accountable for. Vivian genuinely believed ordinary people couldn't afford justice. She assumed money determined who got to define right and wrong. She had mistaken my silence for weakness, my rural lifestyle for ignorance, and my patience for surrender. She never imagined I'd keep every property record my grandfather ever signed, every survey, every tax map, every permit, neatly organized in weatherproof filing cabinets inside the old barn because that's simply how my family had always done things. One rainy Tuesday morning, about 6 weeks after the bridge came down, depositions finally began. Vivian walked into the conference room wearing the same polished confidence she'd carried onto my property that first morning. Claire let her talk, and talk, and talk. Vivian claimed she believed the bridge created a safety hazard. Claire produced the engineering inspection proving it was structurally sound. Vivian claimed she believed an easement existed. Claire produced certified county maps. Vivian claimed contractors acted independently. Claire played the security footage with Vivian personally directing the demolition crew. Then came the question that emptied all the color from Vivian's face. Claire leaned forward and calmly asked, Mrs. Mercer, if you truly believed you had legal authority to remove Mr. Walker's bridge, why did you instruct the contractors to finish before he came outside? The room became completely still. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, looked toward her attorney, then quietly whispered, I don't remember saying that. Claire smiled gently. Fortunately, your own email remembers for you. At that exact moment, I realized this case had stopped being about replacing lumber across a creek. It had become a referendum on what happens when someone mistakes borrowed authority for absolute power. And the hardest part for Vivian wasn't the lawsuit waiting in front of her. It was the growing realization that the very neighbors she'd spent years intimidating were no longer afraid to tell the truth. The trial itself lasted less than 3 days, which surprised almost everyone except Claire. She told me before we walked into the courthouse, Cases like this usually aren't decided by dramatic speeches. They're decided by documents. She was right. Vivian's attorney tried to paint everything as an unfortunate misunderstanding, arguing that his client had acted in what she believed was the community's best interest. But every time he tried to soften the story, another email, another photograph, another witness pulled it right back into reality. Curtis, the contractor, testified that he had questioned whether they had permission before starting and that Vivian insisted they finish quickly because, in her words, the owner will complain no matter what, so let's get it over with. Deputy Holt confirmed she admitted authorizing the demolition at the scene. The county surveyor testified there had never been any dispute about the property line. Even the environmental inspector explained how the demolition unnecessarily damaged the protected creek bank. By the time I took the stand, there wasn't much left for me to prove. Claire simply asked why the bridge mattered. I looked across the courtroom toward the photographs of broken cedar beams and answered honestly, because my father built it with me, and because nobody has the right to erase another family's history just because they don't like looking at it. The courtroom stayed quiet for several seconds. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. It was simply the truth, and sometimes the truth doesn't need anything louder. 2 hours later, the judge issued his ruling. Vivian Mercer was personally liable for trespassing and intentional destruction of private property. The HOA itself was also held responsible because she had acted while representing the association, despite never receiving board approval. The court ordered full restoration costs, punitive damages, attorney's fees, environmental remediation expenses, and mandatory governance reforms requiring independent legal review before any future enforcement action outside subdivision boundaries. But the biggest blow wasn't the money. It came 4 days later during a special HOA meeting packed with angry homeowners. Melissa called me afterward and described the atmosphere. People who had stayed silent for years finally stood up one after another. Some talked about unfair fines. Others described intimidation, selective enforcement, and threats. By the end of the evening, the board voted to remove Vivian as president. 2 other directors resigned before the meeting even ended. A month later, I received a letter from the association's new board. It wasn't written by lawyers. It wasn't filled with legal language. It simply apologized. They admitted trust had been broken and asked permission to help fund a new pedestrian bridge as a gesture of goodwill. I appreciated the offer, but I declined. Not because I was bitter. Because there were some things my family needed to rebuild ourselves. Earl volunteered his tractor. Curtis, the same contractor Vivian had hired, showed up on a Saturday morning and asked if he could donate his crew's labor. I'd rather build one the right way, he said, than spend the rest of my life remembering how we tore the first one down. We shook hands, and that was enough. For 3 weekends, friends, neighbors, and even a few Willow Creek residents worked side by side. We used heavier cedar, stronger steel anchors, and built the new bridge several feet wider than the old one. Before we installed the final handrail, I carved a small line underneath where almost nobody would ever see it. Built twice. Love forever. It wasn't for visitors. It was for Dad. The first evening after everything was finished, I walked across the bridge alone just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The creek sounded exactly the way it had years earlier when Dad and I finished the original one. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Then I realized everything had. I used to believe protecting your property meant protecting land, fences, and buildings. Now I understand it's really about protecting boundaries, the invisible ones that tell people where their authority ends and another person's life begins. Vivian never understood that difference. She believed power came from titles, committees, and rulebooks. What she learned too late was that real authority only exists when it's exercised with humility. Without that, it's just arrogance wearing a name badge. Every now and then, someone driving through Ash Hollow still slows down to look at the bridge. Most have no idea there was ever another one before it. That's probably how it should be. The bridge isn't famous. It isn't expensive. It simply stands where it's supposed to stand, quietly doing the job it was built to do. Funny enough, that's a better legacy than winning an argument. But here's the question I've never completely answered. And maybe you can. If Vivian had simply knocked on my door that first morning and said, "I don't like your bridge. Can we talk?" none of this would have happened. No lawsuit, no headlines, no destroyed careers, no divided neighborhood. Was this really about protecting property values? Or was it about someone becoming so addicted to control that they forgot the difference between leadership and ownership? I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. If you were in my shoes, Would you have accepted the HOA's offer to pay for rebuilding the bridge? Or would you have done exactly what I did and built it yourself? Let me know down in the comments. If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real community conflict stories, and share this with someone who believes common sense should always matter more than power. Until next time, take care of the people around you, and never let anyone convince you that respecting boundaries is optional.